Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Neil Mansfield, the publisher at UIT Cambridge, and I've been working with Sarah for the last 2 years on her book. Thank you all for joining in. We've got attendees today from as far away as Brazil, and they range from interested citizens to food technologists and policymakers, so a lovely audience. Before we start, I'll say just a few words about Sarah's book itself. The model for the book is David Mackay's Sustainable Energy, which we published in 2009. And from that, the Without the Hot Air series grew. The series has several aims. It's aimed at non-specialist readers to reach the widest possible audience and inform them. It doesn't tell the reader what to think. Instead, it educates so people can make up their own mind. And an important part of getting information out in a timely way is that each book tends to address one dimension of the issue as fully as possible, so that debates centered on other dimensions such as politics and economics can be founded on evidence rather than surmise. As David Mackay used to say, we need numbers, not adjectives. Sarah's book is already starting to have an influence. It was cited by the Earl of Caithness in the recent House of Lords debate on the agricultural bill. So it's nice to see we are making progress already. A great feature of the book is that the ebook editions are free. They're available on all the usual ebook retailer sites, which we call open access for everyone. This makes things very easy for ebook consumers. They know how to get their ebooks, and they're used to getting it from, they get it from the usual sources that they're used to. So, for example, where are we? Here is the Amazon screen for the book. You can see that the price is $0, which is correct. You can pre-order the book now, and it will be delivered to you on the publication date, which is the 23rd of September, the 3rd of September, so just about a week away. And then if people want a hard copy, they can get it from Blackwell's, who we know have stock. They ordered it specially. So just a last word about the format of the meeting. This is a Zoom webinar, so it's like a public lecture. There are panelists that everybody can see and hear, and then there are 10 attendees who are not visible. After the talk, we'll have, excuse me, we'll have question and answer with the panelists and Sarah, and you submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A button. So you can do that throughout the meeting as questions occur to you. There's also chat. But that's largely for discussions amongst yourselves. The panelists will only be viewing the Q&As. And finally, a recording of the webinar will be available soon after it ends on our YouTube channel. So that's all from me. Now I have great pleasure to introduce Professor Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal and former president of the Royal Society, who's kindly going to introduce Sarah's talk. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's a real privilege to speak at this launch, the launch of Sarah's informative, entertaining, and important book. I've known Sarah for a long time because we're both astronomers. And astronomy is the grandest environmental science, but is in a sense one of the simplest sciences. Simple compared to biology. That's because the structure of a star or galaxy is far less intricate than even the smallest insect. It's the living world that poses the greatest challenge. And that's why it's wonderful that in this book, Sarah has boldly leapfrogged from the inanimate world to address the intricate linkages between us humans and the rest of the entire biosphere. And she's been well served by her publishers and book designers. The book superbly produced and illustrated. It's a pleasure to read it, whether you're just browsing through to try and soak up the information in the diagrams, or whether you're reading right through it, because there's a huge amount of information there. Indeed, though it can be a bedside book, its natural place is perhaps in the kitchen or on the dining table, so you can find out the carbon budget of any meal you're having. But the book isn't plainly just of domestic interest. Of course, it's globally important, because what we eat collectively affects the world's climate, just as the way we generate energy affects the world's climate. And that, of course, was the theme of the book Renewable Energy Without the Hot Air by the late lamented David Reay, which was the first book in this series, and which I think inspired Sarah a lot. And so, although Sarah's book is written with a light touch, it has a rather somber and challenging message. Because, as she says, about a quarter of the world's CO2 emissions are related to the food we eat. That's, I think, a bigger proportion than transport, about like what we spend on heating our homes. And, of course, the world's goal is to cut overall net CO2 emissions to zero by 2050. But by then, food production in the world will have doubled. That's for a combination of two reasons. First, there'll be at least 2 billion more people in the world. And secondly, we hope that those now in developing countries will be eating a much more nourishing and fuller diet than they have now. And this is a big challenge, because it's clear from the diagrams in Sarah's book that 9 billion people can't all eat like present-day Americans, eating as much beef as they do, without devastating effects on the world's climate and the world's land use. Well, Sarah isn't censorious. She doesn't preach at the reader, but the message she gives is surely that the world's people will have to change diet to a more vegan-style diet, maybe leavened by eating insects and artificial meat and things like that. But the only way we can avoid CO2 rising to dangerous levels is a change in diet, and that's very clear from the diagrams in her book. And it does require a real shift in mindset of voters. It needs a wide public to start to care. This is happening because far more of the public care about climate change. Young people demonstrate, quite rightly so, because they'll be alive at the end of a century, and concern about other environmental issues, like plastics in the ocean, have risen sharply. And it's important that these changes in mindset aren't led by politicians. They're led by charismatic individuals who change public attitudes through books or the media, and the politicians then reflect them. The greatest figures are Rachel Carson, Carl Sagan, David Attenborough, and people like that. And they're supported by many writers and campaigners. And that's why we must hope that this book is indeed widely read. And indeed, Sarah has chosen her publishers well, because through her own altruism and that of the publishers, this book and others in the series will be free to read online. Well, the book's had a long gestation, but I hope Sarah thinks it's been worth it. Certainly, she's performed a huge service, and this book is going to make an enormous impact on the public and thereby indirectly on politicians in the next few years. I've gone on long enough, so let me again congratulate Sarah and hand over to her. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate your perspective and for highlighting a lot of those points that I wanted to make. So, yeah, I really think it's scary to be putting putting ourselves out there as scientists and facing issues in society, but I think you've shown us the importance of that in what you've said and your example that you've given us. So yes, here I go. This is it. So thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate all your kind words and your introduction there. Thank you. I'm going to give a bit of a background to how this book came about, and then going to move into a sort of bit of a sort of summary overview of the book, including some poll questions for you to answer as we go along, and then I'm going to open it up to a panel discussion with Q&A. So please send your Q&A, as Neil said, as you think of them, to the Q&A feature, not to the chat, but the Q&A feature. So I don't think of myself as an author. I've never written a book before. I didn't sit down one day and think, what shall I write a book about? I'm a scientist. As Martin said, I spent the last 20 years doing astrophysics research. I was looking at the shapes of millions of galaxies to find out what the universe is made of. And then almost exactly 5 years ago, I was at a meeting in Cambridge, and we were celebrating because of the big astrophysics results we'd just got out, and we were getting stuck in to the next bit of the project. I'd always dreamed of working out important things in groups of people collaborating, standing at the blackboard or the whiteboard as it is now, and taking turns to add in ideas that come together to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts, figuring out new things. And although it was tough, working out new science results, we spent a lot of time stuck. It turned out to be just as exciting in the best moments. It was just as exciting as I'd imagined when I was little, when I was sitting at home watching science programs on TV with my parents. I'm going to start showing my screen now, see if I can do this. Share. So I was, about 5 years ago, I was at a meeting in Cambridge, as I said, walking along the road, and I bumped into David Mackay, that you've already heard mention of, who's cycling the other way, very much like this picture here by the duck pond in the physics department. And you already heard Neil mention David's name earlier because he wrote this very influential book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. But for me, David was a friend of my dad's and a mentor from way back when I first went to Cambridge as a student. David taught me things in statistics which have been at the heart of my research career in astrophysics. So it was wonderful to see David, as always. And then he said he had some health news. He had stomach cancer. And as Martin alluded, he died a few months later. At first, it was just my way of coping, to sort of try and find out more about what he'd been doing on sustainable energy. I found a slide in one of the last talks he gave. He identified food. This is his slide here on the screen. He identified diet and farming practices, food, as the strongest levers in the global calculator he created. So I wanted to find out more. And about the same time, my kids started school, and I spent a lot of time thinking about life and the future, trying to come to terms with the fact that I'm still here and David isn't. And about the same time, I was wondering what the future is going to be like for my kids, for all our kids, with the climate changing. I was picturing my kids in 20 years' time saying to me, "What did you do about climate change, Mummy?" And me saying, "I looked at the stars." I just couldn't live with that. So I decided that my mission is to try to help reduce the amount of climate change from food. But at the time, I was not thinking about writing a book. I started off trying to increase the amount of food we can grow from each field. I thought I could use my data science skills to look at satellite images of wheat growing in fields, instead of looking at satellite images of galaxies in space. But the more I learnt, the more I realised that kind of voluntary improvements in technology can only take us so far. On their own, they're not going to be enough. And people, citizens, we have to actually change what we're eating, as Martin has said. And we have to demand changes from food producers. The supermarkets do listen, look at plastic, as Martin has said already, and governments can act, but only if we're behind it. For example, look at the sugar tax. So exactly as Martin said, we need to lead this change so that government, and put pressure on governments and food producers, and they will follow. I wanted to read something like David's energy book, but focusing on food, comparing the climate impacts of different food choices that I was making during the day. But that book didn't exist, and so I started trying to find out the answers for myself. After all my confusion about life and death and the future, I find meaning by sitting down every morning and working on this project. I was reading papers that were behind the publisher paywalls that I can access through my university, and I was reconstructing calculations to try to understand them better. And then I realised that I needed to share what I was learning. To change food habits, we need the public to support big changes, and we need detailed information, not hot air. So I don't think of myself as an author, but I believe that a book taking this kind of approach is necessary to achieve the bigger goal. And because that book didn't exist, that's why I tried to write it. I have to admit that working on the book was a lot of agony for an extrovert like me, sitting down for 3 years, sitting and trying to focus on this topic and on my own. But I met lots of amazing collaborators along the way, and it was also cathartic and a lot of fun in the 1% of time when I was actually writing text. It was great. So I'm really relieved and extremely excited to be at this stage of sharing the book with you. I'm so happy about how it came out in the printed edition. Thanks to everyone at UIT for doing a fantastic job. And it's really important to me that the ebook is free, as has been mentioned already, thanks to funding from the University of Manchester. I'm hoping that you'll join us on this mission to try to reduce the amount of climate change caused by food. And I hope that you'll find the book useful to help with that. So that's why I'm going to give you a quick tour, including a few poll questions along the way to whet your appetites. So this is just an overview of the whole of the contents. The book works through different parts of the day, different meals of the day, and looks at different options, comparing them to each other. And then the final part is looking ahead, looking at how we can all work together to make changes. As Martin said already, 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food, and that's increasing as there are more people eating more quality food. And hopefully we're going to reduce the amount of fossil fuels. We have to do that. But when we've done that, then food is going to be the biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions. So the first chapter is very much about putting that into context of different types of emissions from different things and how food fits into that bigger picture. So I'm going to do a poll in a minute. I'm not going to poll you on this question. I'm guessing you might be able to figure out the answer to this. Which causes more climate change, an 8-ounce steak or a jacket potato and beans? For me, the really exciting and important point of all the diagrams in the book, so you'll be able to find the answers to these questions. For example, here you can see this stack diagram for a steak, and it's on exactly the same scale as the other diagrams in the book. So you can see here the microwave potato with beans there on the same scale, so that when we put them next to each other, you can see how they compare. And so it's really about trying to get a better picture of how big things are, not just that one thing is big, one thing is small, but also to send a really positive message that actually if all foods contributed about the same to climate change, we'd be a bit stuck because we have to eat. But actually, because different foods cause very different greenhouse gas emissions, then there's a lot of potential. And there's also potential to change farming practices if we can find out and incentivize and transfer the information about those farming practices and how they contribute to climate change all the way to the consumer. I'm going to do a little poll now about the current average greenhouse gas emissions for different types of food. Now, I haven't given you all the information, so it's a difficult challenge, but this is a poll. I think Vera's going to launch a poll now so that you can join in, and we can all hopefully have a bit of fun provoking some questions from you. So hopefully you can see on your screen right now that there's a question: which option causes the most climate impact? A bowl of cereal, a large latte, or 2 boiled eggs? So we've got about 30 grams of cereal, about 200 grams of milk in there, or a large latte with about 500 grams of milk, or 2 boiled eggs there. So hopefully you're all voting at the moment, and when we've got a few votes in, then Vera will close the poll and we'll all be able to see a histogram. It's all anonymous, but a histogram of how you voted. Okay, wow. So you've all gone for the large latte, which is indeed the correct answer given the quantities of everything that I described earlier, followed by the bowl of cereal and the eggs. So I'm just going to show you the calculations for the average values for all these products, focus mostly on Europe for the milk here. And you can see that, yes, because of the quantity of milk in the latte, and because milk is the dominant thing in each of those, the cereal and the latte, then actually sometimes it's about the quantity of something that we're using rather than necessarily the exact, choosing what we're having. So I think the message for me about this little poll, focusing in on the breakfast part of the book, is that sometimes by reducing the quantities of things, do we really need a large latte? What are the other alternatives? Then we can see that those things would have a big impact on climate change if we chose to change them. Great, thank you for participating in that. I'm going to move on to I'm just going to show you where you can find out more information about that. First of all, I'm just going to show you a few montages from the book so you get a sense of what's in there. So this breakfast part has got various chapters, including the bowl of cereal. You can see there a bowl of cereal with dairy milk or with plant milk. You can see a latte compared to different sorts of tea and coffee, regular tea and coffee, and you can look at different ways of preparing eggs. And you can also see lots and lots of references and endnotes there in the middle panel there, all fully referenced back to the original research literature. Okay, another poll. It's lunchtime. We're going to have a sandwich. Which causes more contribution to climate change? So we've got a chicken sandwich, a cheese sandwich, or a peanut butter and jam sandwich. So hopefully Vera is going to launch the poll now, and you can all join in and participate. We've got the same 50 grams of chicken and cheese in the chicken, 50 grams of chicken in the chicken sandwich, 50 grams of cheese in the cheese sandwich. And then we've got about, I think it's 25 grams of peanut butter in the peanut butter and jam sandwich, because 50 grams of peanut butter is a lot of peanut butter. So that's the sort of typical quantities that people might have. Just going to pause while you all click the button. Okay, we've got the answer coming in there. Gosh, you're all pros. You don't need to read this book. You know the answers already. So, so you've gone for the cheese sandwich. It's got the most votes there, followed by the chicken sandwich, and lastly the peanut butter and jam sandwich. So let's compare those, and actually pretty similar to your polling results in terms of the quantities. So you can see that for a typical type of cheese, then we've got a bit more emissions than for the chicken, which a lot of people are surprised about, but you're all pros on this call. So so you guessed that already, and you can find out more about why that is. You can see milk being turned into cheese here. You can see the amount of milk it takes to produce the amount of cheese. So 10 kilos of milk to produce one kilo of cheese. So that's sort of a bit more background about where the food comes from. And then comparisons with, for example, a steak sandwich and a chicken sandwich and a ham sandwich in the ham, pork and bacon. Great. Okay, we're moving on to snacks now. So which do you think causes more climate change? A 25 gram bar of milk chocolate, a regular size packet of crisps, or a banana? So vote away. Just wait another minute or two until the results come in. Okay, so you've all gone for the bar of chocolate, and the bananas come in second, but by quite a long way behind. Great, well, thank you for joining in. I can see loads of you voting there, so hopefully this makes it a bit more fun than just me sitting here and rabbiting on for ages. So what you can see here, all of these charts that I'm showing you are all on the same scale. So for me, the most important thing to take away from this is actually that all these numbers are really small. But I did ask you to vote on a particular one, didn't I? So you're actually correct there, voting for the milk chocolate. And so you can learn more about that and about how you've got actually more milk in a 25-gram bar of chocolate than 25 grams, because we dry milk into a powder and then we add it into the chocolate bar. But you can see there that the different components there, cocoa, sugar, processing milk, all add up relatively equally. And it really depends a lot on how that cocoa is produced as well, where it comes from. You can read all about this here. One of the points that people tell me they like is that there's key points at the end of each chapter, which give you sort of a little tiny summary of the main. It's kind of agony to write them, to distill it down into a few bullet points, but everyone told me I should do it, and apparently that is quite helpful. So there's key points at the end of each chapter that you can sort of get those summaries from. And then we're moving on to dinner time, the final poll. So the three options for you now are spaghetti bolognese, chicken curry and rice, or fish and chips. So have a go at this one. You've got the three options hopefully on your screen there. So vote away. Because I'm not really being fair by telling you all the exact details of the amount of each ingredient, but I'm just following along with what's in the book, and you can find out lots more there. I'll just wait another minute for the results to come through. Okay, great. So a resounding win for the spaghetti bolognese there, and about roughly equal for the last two. Very few votes for those ones. And so just to reveal the answer to that, the chart actually obscures the photos, because all the numbers are much bigger than the previous numbers that we've looked at. And those of you all voting for the spaghetti bolognese there were right. We've used 125 grams of prime mince there from a beef herd, and you can see how that adds up and compares with all the other ingredients there, and also with the other options. And so you were all correct there. But in the book, there's a lot of discussion there about, for example, different ways of producing, so beef alternatives, but also different ways of producing beef, dairy beef. You know, what if the cows are also producing milk as well as beef? As a consumer, you can't find that information out because it's not written on the packets usually. So how can we get that information to people and improve the way we produce food, as well as the choices that we're making? And there's a few different options there, looking at what if we halve the amount of beef we're using? What if we switch to other alternatives? For example, what if we switch to lentils? What happens when we change different ingredients, and how much does it affect the climate impact, is the kind of questions that I'm trying to answer there. And then the final part is really saying, how can we work together to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food? I think most people can agree that we want to reduce food waste. And there's some top tips there from the Waste Resource Action Programme in the UK about things that actually have been found in research to reduce waste. And then looking at health, just to talk briefly about how some of these things interact with health considerations, the amount of protein we're getting, for example. And really then, what do we want to ask governments to do? And I think that's where I've really concluded that it all comes down to information. I want consumers to demand this detailed information, the most up-to-date information from the actual food producers on the greenhouse gas emissions. So the numbers in this book are the latest numbers in the research literature, but actually individual food producers are doing, you know, new up-to-date things which are not in the academic research literature, and we need to demand that information from food producers. There's so many people I'd love to thank, and I'm really grateful for so much patience from many people explaining this topic to me and answering my many questions about it. If I go through everybody, then we'll be here all evening. So I just really heartfelt thanks to everybody who's supported me, and you know who you are. And I'm just going to single out 3 names, which I just want to particularly thank. Particularly Althea Wilkinson for many days of hard work adding in references and pictures and just checking in on the dark days when I thought I'd never finish this book. So this book would have had many less references without you. So thank you very much, Althea. Thank you to Angelina Frankowska for hours of conversations to help me understand the numbers. And also particularly to my fantastic editor, Neil, who intuitively got what I was trying to do. And despite working through many pages of his red ink, I particularly liked his comments where he said, "Are you trying to say?" and then a sentence, and I couldn't have put it better myself. And that really brings me back to David Mackay, who of course got us both set on this way of thinking, of wanting to empower people to figure things out for themselves. And that's most of all what I want you to get from this book. I'd like to invite you to join us in our bigger goals beyond this book to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food. It's been really a joy over the last couple of years to work with many people on this project, Take a Bite Out of Climate Change. We had a great time last year at the Royal Society Summer Science Exhibition. You can see some of my colleagues there answering many questions at a time when I was writing the book, so that was really helpful to hear everybody's questions and practice answering them and hear all your follow-up questions. We produce these flashcards which you can download for free for Creative Commons license. You can even print them and make money from them if you want to. That's the license that we used for that. There's 72 cards like that. You can play this game right now, Climate Food Challenge, guessing which of the 3 foods causes the most greenhouse gas emissions. And that's written by my fabulous colleague, Andrew Markwick, who I'm very excited to announce has released today a new free tool which contains all of the foods in the book and all the recipes in the book. And you can go to the book website here and try that out and make your own modifications to the recipes in the book. For example, here's the latte that you saw earlier. If you click on this button here, the plus sign, then you can click through and see all the details of that, and you can go and then modify that and then you know, add it up with other things that you've eaten in the day and see how things contribute, compare options. So really excited to announce that now. And I hope you have a lot of fun playing with that, and I hope there's a lot of potential in the future to add more numbers into that beyond the book. This year, the book was delayed, because of COVID, until this date now when it's coming out. So we had a great time this summer, many of my colleagues here. Fantastic to see all your smiling faces. We worked together on this project, Take a Bite Out of Climate Change at Home. Everyone gave up their time for free to do this, and we put 22 videos out, one every weekday in June, that you can watch at your leisure. Interviews with experts and Q&A, and working through worksheets, activity sheets for kids. And I'm particularly excited about this one, where we got kids were making these stack diagrams themselves by hand by adding up different numbers, and you can see this brilliant example by Fairway Primary School here. So, you know, I hope that you're excited about the bigger challenge here of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food, And if you want to join us in that bigger project as well, then please join us on our website here, Take a Bite Out of Climate Change, and you can contact us there as well. I'm going to stop giving my talk now, and I'm going to, very delighted to introduce my fellow panelists for our question and answer session. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and invite David and James to share their screens and welcome them. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Dave Reay. Dave is a Professor of Carbon Management and Education at the University of Edinburgh. And I first came across Dave about 1.5 years ago when Neil sent me a link to Dave's book, Climate Smart Food, which has separate chapters on each common food item, talking about how food production contributes to climate change, thoroughly referenced to the academic literature, and is made free online thanks to university funding, which is an extremely good description of my book as well, that I'd spent 3 years writing by that point. So I had mixed feelings about hearing of Dave's book. But when I'd calmed down enough to have a look, I realised that our books are really complementary. Thoroughly recommend Dave's book and his other books, which I then learnt about on food and climate change more generally, including for kids. And really fun to meet Dave and realise we're both basically passionate about this topic. And thank you so much for joining us, Dave. Can everyone see Dave at this point? I'm just checking. Yes.
You're welcome, Sarah.
And secondly, please welcome James Hand. James is a co-founder of Giki, that's G-I-K-I for anybody that's Googling it right now. And I'm so excited about his new Giki Zero web tool, which works out your climate impact after asking a few short questions. And it gives you a breakdown across food, heating, transport, and so on. And so you can even go in and change all the details, including the amount of each type of food. James has an encyclopedic knowledge of these impacts beyond just food and climate change, and gave me fantastic feedback at a very early stage of the book. So thank you very much for joining us, James.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Great. So I can hear you, and I'm just going to now switch to the Q&A, and we're going to launch in. I don't know if you want to say anything first, maybe James or Dave.
I just want to say, well done. I mean, you know, from tinkering in terms of when I was looking at climate smart food and trying to look at the numbers and do the kind of analysis you've done, I didn't get anywhere near that kind of depth and robustness. And, you know, it's no long, it took you a while, because that's a lot of literature, that's a lot of calculations. It's so vital, like you and Martin have set out in terms of how important this is. But the effort you put in is immense. And so I really do take my hat off to you, Sarah. Well done.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Yeah, and I think the timing is really important. And it's important for two reasons. The first is that, as we said earlier, we've got to get to net zero by 2050. But that means from today, we've got to start doing things. By 2030, the average footprint in the UK has got to get down to about 2.5 tons. And the second reason is that interest is growing in this topic literally week by week at the moment, which is so encouraging to see. And a lot of that is individuals now asking what can they do? And people want practical solutions, practical everyday solutions. And that's the great thing about food, is that when we get off this call, most of us are going to have dinner, and we can start there. So giving that to people, you know, the right here, right now, I think is really important. So I think it's the timing's fantastic.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thanks to everybody who sent in loads of great questions. I can see lots here. So I'm going to try and see how many we can get through. One question here, I guess everyone going vegan is the ideal solution, but some people won't. What are the best intermediate solutions? So where to begin with that? I'm going to start by asking James, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And when we look at people and how they change their behaviour, it's also entirely right. Very few people go from a normal UK diet to a vegan diet. It happens, but it's unusual. Most people tend to go in steps. So things like having more vegetarian lunches, cutting back on cheese, mixing in plant-based alternatives to meat. These are all the steps that people can take to make a big difference. And actually, you can get a long way to having the footprint of a vegan-like diet with a lot of those things. So I think it's a good point, and it shouldn't put people off that they can make a huge difference by doing lots of those steps around dairy, around meat, basically less and better quality before perhaps, if they choose to, going all the way to a fully plant-based diet.
Excellent, thank you, James. Dave, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just to echo James, really, in that it's a continuum, isn't it? I mean, I guess all of us, in terms of our families and our diets, they change over time. And one of the things, if you work on climate change, certainly if you read Sarah's book, it kind of opens your eyes to how important that is in terms of the environmental impact. And so for us, it's certainly been an evolution of finding out alternatives and finding out how good some of those are. So some of the plant-based milks, things like the plant-based meats as well, and the mycoproteins. The kids weren't absolutely overjoyed at making that transition to start with, and then when they found actually they tasted in many cases even better, then we gradually moved. So I think it is a continuum, but it's certainly it's one of those things where as demand grows, as we're seeing in the shops, then the products, you know, become available, the price comes down, the quality goes up. So we're kind of, it's one of those positive feedbacks really in terms of the transition away from high carbon food, I think.
Great, yeah, and I guess I would, the only thing I'd add to those things, which I totally agree with, is that for me, it's about a process of how we learn about greenhouse gas emissions from foods, rather than necessarily jumping to the conclusion that we all need to go vegan. I think that, you know, it is true on average that the animal products do tend to have higher emissions than plant-based products. On the other hand, there is a range, and also there are lots we can do about farming practices. And I would say it's very much about quantity as well. So looking at as James said, about the amount of animal products, and not necessarily about cutting everything out, and looking at other things like air freight and you know, cooking emissions, that kind of thing. So there's lots of other things as well, which I'd encourage people to think about. Great, okay. I guess we should move on to the next question. The budget you've used is 3 kilos per person per day. So that's halving the average greenhouse gas emissions from food, but we need to go further. Can improving farming methods deliver the extra necessary? So maybe I'll go to Dave, then James after that. Dave, do you want to start?
Sorry, Sarah, I was busy typing in the chat. Please repeat. It's my fault. I was typing about corn nuggets.
So the budget, so the question is about how can we improve farming methods to deliver even more cuts to emissions than just changing food choices?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously a lot of the emissions that are associated with our food are in the production phase, so on the farm. And actually we've got a huge array of solutions in terms of increasing efficiency of production, lowering the different greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously we hear a lot about carbon dioxide, but for food, actually a lot of our climate impact comes from methane and nitrous oxide. So a couple of other greenhouse gases, which are really powerful. And for all of them, actually, we have some really good options to reduce those emissions. One of the major barriers for those is less the research, because we've got options. It's more the access to those. So how we support farming and support that transition to lower carbon practices, and particularly that accessibility, not just within certain farmers who have the time and the money to invest in low carbon farming, but actually making that a really wide area of access. So I guess globally as well as within the UK. So yeah, there's this huge amount we can do. And I think in terms of the UK, the science is at a really high level for working with the farming community to enable us to do this, but that needs to actually be replicated around the world. And so we have a real role there, I guess, as scientists and farmers in the UK to work with partners overseas to make that transition.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Dave. James, did you want to add anything?
Just that, you know, I know far less about the individual sort of what farmers can do, and one thing you do know is that they care so much about the land, they will find ways to make it sort of better for conservation of the local environment and the quality of the food they produce. One thing we can all think of as sort of consumers is where that food comes from, and importantly what it gets fed, and in particular on the soy. So a lot of the soy that goes into animal feed comes from areas like the Amazon, and those are the types of questions that kind of will make the process less carbon intensive, but also need the backing of consumers to start demanding things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's there's lots of new types of feed that we can use, but you also raise this additional issue of land, and just to sort of add to what you both said, for me the biggest sort of surprise writing the book was to really understand how important land is in all of this, the land that we use to grow our food, but also what land can do for us in terms of helping to solve climate change, if we were to all agree to do that. And so this idea that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from food, we can go further than 3 kilos per person per day if we change our diets even more radically, and if we have improvements to farming practices. But actually, if we eat the lowest greenhouse gas emissions foods, we're also tending to eat foods which use much less land. And if we then use that land for things that help climate change, for example, forests, then that can actually suck out, in the most extreme cases, as much as 3 kilos per person per day of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So we can actually marry those two things together, and we could, in principle, make that entirely net zero. So that's a huge surprise to me about what we can do with land, and that feels like a whole different book in a way. But that's the way that I left the book, is just this positive message about what we can do with the land if we can work together.
I think that's a good point in terms of it's called net zero, because we've got to balance it up. You can't have a zero carbon lifestyle, but you can when you do exactly like you said, the other things on to sort of to balance it up, planting trees, protecting forests, that will help.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'm seeing we've got 26 questions in the Q&A, and we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to try and squeeze 2 more in. So the second to last one I'm going to try and squeeze in. Do you think that we might be able to get some sort of emissions tracking and even labelling on food and other goods in the future? So I'm going to go to James first, and then Dave after that. James.
I hope we will, and you're seeing some companies who are starting to lead the way on that. So in the UK, Oatly, corn, I think as of very recently Flora, and has been announced Unilever, and you buy many of their products that you probably don't realise. The first 2 are doing it, the second 2 are planning to do it. So that is starting to change, and I think it's vitally important, because it needs to be shown to people when they pick something up in their hands, so that they can make those sorts of decisions. So yes, hopefully that is something that we're going to see the real pioneers making that progress over the coming years. It will take time though. It's a complicated process for them to build the sort of the models to be able to footprint their products. But yeah, it's happening, and hopefully it will accelerate.
Brilliant. Well, I didn't know that about Flora and Unilever. That's brilliant. Dave, anything to add?
Yeah, I just think it's desperately needed. So all the people who are on this call, the people who will read your book, Sarah, they want to know about the climate impact of their food, and they want to make informed choices. And at the moment, that's really almost impossible to do, because the labelling just isn't there. And so we need something, whether it's a traffic light system, something that, I mean, my bugbear is air freighted food. And so, like we've discussed before, as a bare minimum, having maybe a symbol with an airplane on the packet with kind of fart symbols coming out the back to tell me when I'm in the shops, this has come by plane. So I can make an informed decision. I can say, I still want my out of season blueberries, or I can go, actually, no, this has a high carbon footprint. Yeah, that information is really important now, and obviously you're leading the way in providing that.
Brilliant. Yeah, I couldn't agree with both of you more. And I without, at the risk of getting into trouble with my publishers, in my dreams, the exact numbers in this book would be out of date soon, because everyone's providing the detailed information on the packets. So that would be amazing. I'm just going to try and wrap up with just one final question before I pass back to Neil. If I'm going to change one thing tomorrow to help climate change, what would it be? Which is, I find the hardest question to answer, but I guess I'll go to Dave first and then James.
Yeah, so there are so many things that come to mind because climate change is everywhere in terms of what we do. Given we're talking about food, and you have mentioned it, obviously you mentioned it a lot in your book, Sarah, it's food waste would be my thing. We've been really aware of our food and where it comes from, or more aware of it during COVID and lockdown, and looking at the food in our fridge and our cupboards and worrying about if we've got enough. But we're probably less aware about how much is wasted globally, around over a quarter of the food that's produced, and that has a huge climate impact. And actually, in the UK and in the West, most of that is at the consumer phase. It's in our households. So that would be the thing for me. If we can hammer down food waste, that will really open up such an opportunity in terms of, like you say, using land for other things like carbon sequestration. It will mean, a huge reduction, not just in greenhouse gas emissions, but also in the nitrogen fertilizer use, the kind of vulnerability of our food production system. So yeah, food waste for me would be the one to target, and that's looking at what you've got, making a list when you go to the shops, looking at what's going into the waste bin each week, and going, actually, can we change what we're doing to reduce that?
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a good one that we can all agree on as well, isn't it? Food waste. Fantastic. James, any thoughts?
It sounds like from the questions and the polls, there are a lot of experts on this call. So many of you would have heard the sort of Michael Pollan quote before, eat real food, not too much, mainly plants. And I'd add to that, buy it in season. And if you do that in terms of your diet, then that's going to make big strides compared to the typical UK diet in terms of the footprint, and much more palatable than sort of banning yourself from things, which is often much harder to do.
Great. Yeah, and I guess I'm trying to restrain myself from a sort of self-serving kind of answer to the question. But what I tend to find, as you say, there's a lot of experts on this call. I can see the poll questions, as you said, have come out. You know a lot already on this call. So I'm going to give a slightly different answer, which is, for example, when we give this talk at these kind of stands, we talk to people at science festivals, and people come and they say, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing the other already. What else can I do to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions even more? And if we think about the maths of that, we think about somebody who's already trying quite hard to reduce their emissions. So let's imagine maybe they're a half or a third of the UK average food greenhouse gas emissions already because of the things they're already doing. And they could work really hard to shave another 10, 20, 30% off that by changing even more things. But actually, if you think about the impact of that compared to that person going and talking to somebody else, and maybe influencing them to reduce their emissions by 10%, they could have, if they could influence maybe more than one person, that could have a much bigger impact than going even further once you've already made quite a lot of reductions. So I guess it's a self-serving answer in the sense that it's talk to people about this topic, but I'm doing this I'm doing this because I want everyone to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food, and I think the only way we're going to do that is if we talk about it and we all get behind it, so that when politicians are deciding whether or not to do the right things, for example, mandating emissions labelling, then they know that there's a consumer support for that, and that they're not going to be losing their votes and being kicked out because they've done something unpopular. So I think it's really essential we all talk to each other about this topic, and I hope that this book helps with that. And I'm immensely grateful to Dave and James and Martin for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to my wonderful editor Neil now to wrap up. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Sarah, Dave and James. That's a very interesting Q&A. Thanks to everybody who asked the questions and for all the comments on chats, some of which the panelists didn't see. We'll have a chat amongst ourselves afterwards and see if we can find a way to answer all the questions that we didn't have time to get to and then we'll email you about this later. So it's time to finish. The recording will be available on YouTube very shortly. Do pre-order the free ebook. Pre-ordering, especially before the 3rd of September, the publication date, lifts the book's rankings and helps give it promotion and publicity. Review it on Amazon and tell your friends about it. Do pre-order, even if you're not a great ebook user. Apart from anything else, ordering the ebook makes you a verified purchaser as far as Amazon are concerned, and they give more weight to your review. Some people in the chat and in the Q&A have said this book ought to be on every school syllabus. Well, that sort of can happen. With David Mackay's Sustainable Energy book, the National Grid bought 4,000 copies to distribute to schools, and another thing was Bill Gates bought 2,000 so that everybody at his TED Talk could have a copy, which I think is a bit showing off, but nice all the same. So if people do know of places that might be interested in special bulk orders at special rates, we would be very, very pleased to help get the book out to special audiences like that. So now all that remains for me to do is to thank Professor Martin Rees for introducing Sarah. It was a great honor to have you. To thank our panelists for an interesting discussion. I suppose we have to thank Sarah as well. She had some small part in this book. Thank you very much for an important book, and all the time and agony and the time spent alone in your lonely pit with nobody to talk to, just doing the hard slog of making a book. Thanks to Manchester University, because it's through their generosity that the ebook is free to everybody. Thanks to everybody who endorsed the book and whose endorsement encouraged Sarah, because it is a tough slog when you're working on your own. We also had what we called a buzz group of people who have helped and continue to help publicize the book, and we've had some great ideas on who we can contact and things that we can do. And finally, thank all of you for attending. The slide is a summary of what to do next. Thank you very much. And that, I think, is the end of that. So.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for coming and all your great questions and chat, which we'll go through afterwards. Thank you again.
And I'll leave you here. Bye-bye.
Bye.